April 4th, 1968, 6:01 p.m. The Lorraine Motel, Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. steps onto the balcony of room 306. He's joking with musician Ben Branch about playing a song at that night's rally. A single shot rings out. King falls backward, a massive wound in his jaw and neck. He dies an hour later at St. Joseph's Hospital. He was 39 years old. Within hours, police identify a suspect, a white Mustang speeding from the scene, a rifle found in a doorway, fingerprints, a name, James Earl Ray, small-time criminal, escaped convict, racist, the perfect lone gunman, case closed. Except nothing about Martin Luther King's assassination makes sense. The ballistics don't match. Key witnesses change their stories. Evidence disappeared, and most damning of all, the FBI had been trying to destroy King for years. They had wiretapped his phones. They had infiltrated his organization. They had sent him anonymous letters literally urging him to kill himself. They had called him the most dangerous man in America. And on April 4th, 1968, the most heavily surveilled man in America was killed. And somehow, nobody saw it coming. This isn't a conspiracy theory. In 1999, a Memphis jury heard 12 days of testimony and deliberated for less than 1 hour before reaching their verdict. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated as a result of a conspiracy that involved agents of the United States government. The question isn't whether there was a conspiracy. The question is how deep it went and who gave the order. Let's start at the beginning, not April 4th, 1968, but years earlier, when the FBI first decided that Martin Luther King Jr. was a threat that needed to be neutralized. In 1963, Dr. King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington. 250,000 people heard him speak about his vision of an America where his children would be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. The speech was broadcast on television. It moved the nation. It became one of the defining moments of the civil rights movement. At FBI headquarters, J. Edgar Hoover watched the speech with growing alarm. The next day, he sent a memo to his top officials. The memo described Dr. King as the most dangerous Negro in America. Hoover ordered the FBI to intensify its surveillance and to find ways to neutralize King's effectiveness as a leader. This wasn't normal law enforcement surveillance. This was a political operation to destroy a man that Hoover personally despised. The FBI launched a program called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program. Officially, COINTELPRO was created to monitor and disrupt groups that posed a threat to national security. Communist organizations, radical political groups, potential terrorists. But COINTELPRO became something far more sinister. It became a weapon used against American citizens who were exercising their constitutional rights. Civil rights activists, anti-war protesters, student organizers. Anyone who challenged the status quo became a target, and the FBI's primary target in the civil rights movement was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The surveillance began with wiretaps. The FBI obtained authorization to tap King's home phone, his office phones, and the phones of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization he led. FBI agents listened to every call. They recorded every conversation. They built files documenting every aspect of King's personal and professional life. But the FBI wanted more than just information. They wanted ammunition. They wanted to find something, anything, they could use to discredit King and destroy his reputation. They found it in King's personal life. The FBI wiretaps captured evidence of extramarital affairs. King, a Baptist minister and married man, was having relationships with other women. This was deeply hypocritical for a moral leader, and the FBI knew it was explosive information that could destroy King's credibility. In November 1964, FBI officials decided to weaponize this information. They compiled audio recordings from the wiretaps that documented King's affairs. They packaged the recordings with an anonymous typed letter and mailed it to King's home address, timed to arrive while he was away, so his wife Coretta would likely open it first. The letter was chilling. It called King a fraud and a liar. It described him as evil and immoral, and then it made its true purpose clear. The letter told King there was only one way out. It urged him to commit suicide before his secrets were revealed. It gave him a deadline, 34 days before the revelation. This wasn't law enforcement. This was psychological warfare conducted by agents of the United States government against an American citizen. The FBI was literally trying to drive Dr. King to kill himself. King didn't commit suicide, but he understood the message. The government wasn't just watching him, they were actively trying to destroy him. Over the next 3 years, FBI harassment intensified. Agents spread false rumors about King to discredit him. They sent fake letters to civil rights organizations trying to create divisions and mistrust. They provided derogatory information about King to journalists, hoping to generate negative press coverage. J. Edgar Hoover personally briefed President Lyndon Johnson on King's personal life, characterizing King as a hypocrite and a fraud. Hoover told Johnson that King was under the influence of communist advisors, a claim the FBI never substantiated but repeated constantly. By 1968, the FBI had compiled thousands of pages of files on King. They knew his schedule. They knew his plans. They knew where he was going to be and when, which makes what happened in Memphis all the more suspicious. In March 1968, Dr. King traveled to Memphis to support striking sanitation workers. The workers, almost all African American, were demanding better pay and working conditions after 2 workers had been crushed to death in a malfunctioning garbage truck. King saw their struggle as part of the larger fight for economic justice. On March 28th, King led a march through downtown Memphis. The march turned violent when some protesters began breaking windows and looting. Police responded with tear gas and force. One 16-year-old boy was shot and killed by police. King was devastated. His philosophy of nonviolent protest had been undermined. He vowed to return to Memphis for another march to prove that nonviolent protest could work. He returned on April 3rd. He checked into the Lorraine Motel, a modest establishment popular with African American travelers. He was given room 306 on the 2nd floor with a balcony overlooking the parking lot. King was exhausted. He was depressed. He had been receiving death threats for years, and they had intensified recently. At a church service on the night of April 3rd, King delivered what would become known as his mountaintop speech. He spoke about the threats against his life. He said he had been to the mountaintop and seen the promised land. He said he might not get there with his people, but they would get there as a people. It was as if he knew what was coming. The next day, April 4th, King spent the afternoon in room 306 meeting with aides and planning the upcoming march. At around 6 p.m., he stepped out onto the balcony to get some fresh air before heading to dinner. He was joking with friends in the parking lot below. Musician Ben Branch was standing nearby. King called down to him, asking him to play "Take My Hand, Precious Lord" at that night's rally. At 6:01 p.m., a single rifle shot echoed across the parking lot. The bullet struck King in the right jaw, traveled through his neck, severed his spinal cord, and lodged in his shoulder blade. King collapsed backward onto the balcony floor. Friends rushed to him. He was still conscious, but unable to speak. Blood poured from the massive wound. An ambulance arrived within minutes. King was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital. Doctors worked desperately to save him, but the damage was catastrophic. At 7:05 p.m., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead. He had been killed by a single shot fired from across the street. The investigation began immediately, and from the very beginning, the official story didn't make sense. According to police, the shot had been fired from a bathroom window in a rooming house across the street from the Lorraine Motel. The rooming house was located at 422.5 South Main Street, approximately 205 feet from where King was standing on the balcony. A tenant in the rooming house told police he had seen a man with a bundle go into the communal bathroom shortly before the shooting. After hearing the shot, he saw the same man leave the bathroom and run down the hallway toward the stairs. Police found a bundle in the doorway of Canapé's Amusement Company, a store located below the rooming house. The bundle contained a Remington 30-06 rifle with a scope, a pair of binoculars, some clothing, and a portable radio. All items had been wrapped in a green bedspread. The rifle had fingerprints on it. The fingerprints matched a fugitive named James Earl Ray. Ray was a 40-year-old petty criminal from Illinois. He had a long record of minor offenses: burglary, forgery, armed robbery. In 1967, he had escaped from Missouri State Penitentiary, where he was serving 20 years for armed robbery. After his escape, Ray had traveled to Mexico, then to Los Angeles, then to New Orleans, and finally to Memphis, where he checked into the rooming house on April 4th under the alias John Willard. According to the FBI, Ray rented a room in the rooming house that afternoon. He asked for a room with a view. He was given room 5B, which had a window overlooking the Lorraine Motel. But the angle wasn't quite right, so Ray went to the communal bathroom, which had a better view. From that bathroom window, the FBI claimed, Ray steadied the rifle on the windowsill and waited. When King stepped onto the balcony at 6:01 p.m., Ray fired a single shot. He then bundled the rifle in the bedspread, ran out of the rooming house, dropped the bundle in the doorway to avoid being caught with it, jumped into his white Mustang parked nearby, and drove away. Police found the Mustang abandoned in Atlanta 2 days later. The FBI launched a massive international manhunt for Ray. He was arrested on June 8, 1968, at London's Heathrow Airport trying to board a flight to Brussels. He was using a Canadian passport under the alias Ramon George Snade. Ray was extradited to the United States. He was charged with first-degree murder. Facing the death penalty and under pressure from his attorney, Ray entered a guilty plea in March 1969. He was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Case closed. Lone gunman, motivated by racism. No conspiracy. Except 3 days after pleading guilty, James Earl Ray recanted. He wrote a letter to the judge saying he was innocent, that he had been pressured into pleading guilty, and that he wanted a trial. He would spend the next 29 years in prison insisting he had been set up as a patsy, and the evidence suggests he was right. Let's start with the most basic question. Could James Earl Ray have made that shot? Ray had some experience with rifles from his time in the Army, but he was not a trained marksman. The shot that killed Dr. King was approximately 205 feet, fired from an awkward position in a cramped bathroom, through a dirty window at a downward angle, hitting a moving target. It would have required considerable skill. More importantly, Ray had never shown any interest in political violence. His criminal record was extensive but nonviolent. Burglary, forgery, robbery. He had never committed or attempted murder. He had never been involved in any racist organizations or political groups. There was no evidence that Ray was obsessed with King or had been planning to kill him, so how did Ray, a small-time criminal with no history of political violence and no known motive beyond general racism, suddenly decide to assassinate the most famous civil rights leader in America and successfully pull it off? The official story requires us to believe that Ray, acting entirely alone, planned and executed a perfect assassination, that he obtained a rifle, practiced with it, tracked King's movements, positioned himself at the perfect location, made a difficult shot under pressure, and almost escaped. But the evidence tells a different story. After his arrest, Ray told a consistent story. He said he had been set up. He said a man he knew only as Raul had manipulated him into being in Memphis at the exact time and place of the assassination. He said Raul had given him money and instructions. He said Raul had told him to buy a rifle and deliver it to a location in Memphis. He said he had no idea he was being used as part of an assassination plot until after King was killed. Prosecutors dismissed Ray's story as an obvious fabrication. A mysterious figure named Raul, who conveniently couldn't be found or identified. It sounded like a desperate lie, but Ray's story was remarkably consistent over 29 years. And some details checked out. Ray's finances made no sense. In the year before the assassination, Ray, a recently escaped convict with no job and no income, somehow had significant amounts of money. He paid cash for a car, he traveled extensively, he took dancing lessons, he underwent plastic surgery to alter his appearance, he stayed in hotels and apartments. All of this required thousands of dollars. Where did the money come from? Ray claimed Raul gave it to him for running errands. Prosecutors said Ray robbed a bank in London, but they could never prove it. The source of Ray's money remains unexplained. Then there's the rifle. Ray purchased the murder weapon on March 30th, 1968, at Aero Marine Supply Company in Birmingham, Alabama. But he didn't just walk in and buy a rifle. He purchased a specific model, a Remington 760 Game Master, with a scope. Then he came back the next day and exchanged it for a different model, a Remington 30-06 with a different scope. Why the exchange? Ray told store employees that he had talked to his brother, and his brother recommended the more powerful rifle for deer hunting. But Ray didn't have a brother who knew about rifles, and he wasn't planning to go deer hunting. Someone told him to get that specific rifle. Someone who knew it would be the right weapon for the job. The rifle itself raises questions. After the shooting, the weapon was found in the doorway bundle with Ray's fingerprints on it. But no fingerprints were found on the binoculars, the radio, or other items in the bundle, and, critically, no fingerprints were found in the bathroom where the shot was allegedly fired. No prints on the windowsill, the bathtub, the doorknob, the walls, nothing. If Ray had spent time in that bathroom, steadying a rifle and firing a shot, there should have been prints everywhere. The absence of prints suggests the bathroom was wiped clean. Why would Ray carefully wipe down the bathroom but then leave his prints all over the rifle he dropped in the doorway? Unless someone else fired from the bathroom, cleaned the scene, and then planted the rifle with Ray's prints on it to frame him. Then there's the ballistics. The FBI claimed the bullet removed from King's body was fired from the rifle found in the doorway, but the bullet was severely damaged and fragmented. Ballistics experts who examined the evidence said it was impossible to make a definitive match. The bullet could have come from that rifle or from any similar rifle. More problematic, the trajectory didn't match. The bullet struck King at a downward angle consistent with a shot from an elevated position across the street. But multiple experts who studied the crime scene and the autopsy results said the angle was too steep to have come from the bathroom window. The trajectory was more consistent with a shot from a lower position, possibly from brush at ground level near the rooming house. If the shot didn't come from the bathroom window, where did it come from, and who was in the bathroom? Several witnesses in the rooming house told police they saw a man in the bathroom around the time of the shooting. They described him as wearing a dark suit. James Earl Ray was wearing casual clothes that day, not a suit. The description didn't match. One witness, Charles Stevens, initially told police he saw a man leave the bathroom and run down the hall, but he was drunk at the time, and his description was vague. Stevens later changed his story multiple times, eventually testifying at trial that he had seen Ray. But Stevens' credibility was destroyed when it was revealed that the FBI had paid him for his testimony and had promised to relocate him and his wife. Stevens' wife, Grace, was also in the rooming house. She told police she looked out their window right after the shot and saw a man in a white Mustang parked below. But she said the man was not James Earl Ray. The FBI never called her to testify. Instead, they had her committed to a mental institution where she remained for 10 years. Her testimony was effectively silenced. Other witnesses told even more disturbing stories. A taxi driver named James McCraw was parked near the Lorraine Motel when he heard the shot. He saw a man running from brush near the rooming house, not from the rooming house itself. The man was wearing a dark suit and carrying something. McCraw tried to tell police, but they weren't interested in his statement. Solomon Jones, Dr. King's driver, was standing in the parking lot when King was shot. Immediately after the shot, Jones looked toward where the sound came from. He saw a man in the brush across the street, ducking down and moving away. Jones told police this the night of the assassination. His statement was recorded, but he was never called to testify at trial. Multiple witnesses saw someone in or near the brush area. None saw anyone firing from the bathroom window. But the FBI ignored these witnesses and focused exclusively on evidence that pointed to James Earl Ray firing from the bathroom. Why? The answer might lie in what was happening in Memphis that day beyond the rooming house. On April 4th, 1968, the day Dr. King was killed, Memphis police had removed their usual security detail from the Lorraine motel. Normally, when King was in town, there were uniformed officers stationed nearby for his protection. On April 4th, those officers were pulled back. The official explanation was that King's aides had requested they leave. King's aides denied making any such request. Additionally, the two black Memphis police detectives who usually provided close security for King were inexplicably reassigned on April 4th. Detective Ed Redditt was pulled from his post hours before the shooting and told there was a threat against his life. He was sent home under guard. Detective Willie Richmond was also removed from his assignment. Both men had been protecting King. Both were removed just before he was killed. The military was also present in Memphis. The 111th Military Intelligence Group had agents in Memphis monitoring King's activities. This was part of a broader military intelligence operation to surveil domestic political figures. The Army would later admit they had photographers in Memphis that day taking pictures of King and his associates. Years later, a former military intelligence officer named Jack Terrell testified that he had been told by a fellow officer that military intelligence had advanced knowledge of a plot to kill King in Memphis and had done nothing to stop it. Then there's the question of the FBI's presence. The FBI had been surveilling King intensely for years. They knew his schedule. They knew he was in Memphis. They knew he was staying at the Lorraine Motel. They had informants inside his organization who reported his movements. The FBI knew everything about King's activities in Memphis, except they claimed that someone was planning to kill him. After the assassination, the FBI launched an immediate, massive investigation. More than 3,000 agents worked on the case. But from the beginning, the investigation had a predetermined conclusion. The FBI was looking for evidence that James Earl Ray acted alone. Evidence of a conspiracy was ignored or suppressed. Witnesses who contradicted the lone gunman theory were not called to testify. Physical evidence that didn't fit the narrative was dismissed. Alternative theories were not pursued. The FBI wanted Ray to be the lone assassin, and they built a case accordingly. James Earl Ray spent 29 years in prison, insisting he was innocent. He demanded a trial. He was never given one. Tennessee prosecutors fought for decades to prevent Ray from having his day in court, claiming his guilty plea was final and binding. In 1993, Lloyd Jowers, the owner of Jim's Grill, a restaurant located below the rooming house, went public with a stunning claim. Jowers said he had been part of a conspiracy to kill King. He said he had been paid $100,000 to help facilitate the assassination. He said the plan involved Memphis police, organized crime figures, and federal agents. He said the actual shooter was not James Earl Ray, but a Memphis police officer named Earl Clark, who had fired from the brush area behind the restaurant. Jowers provided details that could only have been known by someone who was involved. He said the murder weapon had been brought to his restaurant after the shooting, and he had disposed of it. He said he had been threatened with death if he ever revealed what he knew. In 1999, the King family, convinced that Ray had been framed, filed a wrongful death civil suit against Lloyd Jowers and other unknown co-conspirators. The trial lasted 4 weeks. 70 witnesses testified. The jury heard evidence of FBI harassment of King, of military intelligence surveillance, of Memphis police being pulled from security duty, of witnesses who saw shooters other than James Earl Ray. On December 8, 1999, after less than 1 hour of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. They found that Lloyd Jowers and others, including governmental agencies, were party to a conspiracy to assassinate Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. A jury, after hearing all the evidence, concluded that the United States government was involved in killing Dr. King. The verdict received minimal media coverage. Most Americans never heard about it. And the federal government dismissed the verdict as meaningless, claiming the civil trial couldn't determine criminal guilt. But the verdict confirmed what many had suspected for decades. Dr. King wasn't killed by a lone racist. He was killed by a conspiracy that reached into law enforcement, intelligence agencies, and the federal government itself. James Earl Ray died in prison on April 23, 1998, 30 years after King's assassination. He was 68 years old. Until his death, he maintained his innocence. He insisted he had been set up as a patsy by a man named Raoul, and by forces he didn't fully understand. Members of the King family believed him. They publicly stated that they did not think Ray killed Dr. King. Dexter King, Martin Luther King's son, visited Ray in prison and told him, "I believe you, and my family believes you." If Ray didn't kill King, who did? The evidence points to a conspiracy involving multiple parties with convergent interests. Memphis police. King was in Memphis supporting striking sanitation workers, embarrassing the city's leadership and threatening public order. Local authorities wanted King gone. Organized crime. Lloyd Jowers had connections to organized crime figures in Memphis and New Orleans. The Mafia had worked with the FBI and CIA on various operations and had the resources to carry out professional hits. The FBI. J. Edgar Hoover hated King and had spent years trying to destroy him. The FBI's COINTELPRO operation had already crossed every ethical and legal line. Was murder really that much further? Military intelligence? The Army was conducting domestic surveillance on political figures as part of a broader program to monitor dissent. They had agents in Memphis. They had photographers. They knew King was there. The truth is, probably a convergence, not a single conspiracy, but multiple parties with overlapping interests. Some provided intelligence, some provided access, some pulled security, some executed the hit, some covered it up. And at the center of it all was a simple truth. Martin Luther King, Jr. was the most dangerous man in America, not because he advocated violence, but because he didn't. He was winning. His philosophy of nonviolent resistance was working. He had forced the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He had changed America, and by 1968, he was expanding his mission. He was no longer just fighting for racial equality. He was fighting for economic justice. He was organizing the Poor People's Campaign, a multiracial coalition of poor Americans demanding economic reform. He was speaking out against the Vietnam War, calling it immoral and unjust. King was building a coalition that could fundamentally challenge American power structures, not just Southern segregation, not just racial discrimination, but the economic and military systems that kept poor people poor and sent young men to die in Southeast Asia. That made him more than dangerous. That made him intolerable. 3 weeks before his death, King delivered a sermon at the National Cathedral in Washington. He talked about the three evils of society: racism, poverty, and militarism. He said these evils were interconnected and had to be fought together. He said America needed a revolution of values. J. Edgar Hoover was in the audience that day. After the speech, he reportedly said that King was becoming even more dangerous than he had feared. On April 4th, 1968, that danger was eliminated. The files on Dr. King's assassination remain partially classified. Thousands of pages of FBI documents have never been released. The stated reason is protecting sources and methods and respecting privacy interests. But the real reason is simpler. The files would confirm what the 1999 jury concluded, that the government was involved. In 2027, many of these files are scheduled to be declassified under the JFK Records Act, which also covers files related to the King assassination. But there's already been pressure to extend the classification to keep the secrets buried, because releasing those files would require a reckoning. It would force America to confront the fact that its own government conspired to murder one of the greatest moral leaders in its history. Dr. King was killed because he was effective, because he was winning, because he was building a movement that could transform America. The powers that be couldn't allow that transformation to happen, so they killed him. They sent a petty criminal to Memphis with money and instructions. They pulled police security. They positioned a shooter. They fired a single shot, and then they spent 50 years lying about it. James Earl Ray was the patsy, just like he said, just like Lee Harvey Oswald said before him. Both men set up to take the fall for assassinations carried out by forces larger than themselves. The difference is that with King, we have more evidence. We have the COINTELPRO documents showing the FBI's campaign to destroy him. We have the suicide letter. We have witness testimony. We have Lloyd Jower's confession. We have a jury verdict. We know what happened. We know who was responsible. We just can't prove it in a criminal court because the evidence has been classified, the witnesses are dead, and the statute of limitations has run out. The killers got away with it, not because they were clever, but because they had badges, because they had institutional power, because they could classify documents and silence witnesses and control the narrative, and because most Americans didn't want to believe their government would do such a thing. But it did. On April 4th, 1968, at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, agents of the United States government murdered Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. They killed him because he dreamed of an America that was more just, more equal, more peaceful than the America they wanted to preserve. They killed him because he was leading a movement that could actually achieve that dream. They killed him because nonviolence was working. And then they blamed a nobody named James Earl Ray and called it solved. 60 years later, the Lorraine Motel is now the National Civil Rights Museum. Visitors can stand on the balcony where King fell. They can see the rooming house across the street where the shot allegedly came from. They can walk through exhibits about the civil rights movement and King's legacy. What they won't see is the full truth about who killed him and why. That truth remains locked in classified files at FBI headquarters and the National Archives. Thousands of pages documenting surveillance, harassment, conspiracy, and murder. The files will be released eventually, maybe in 2027, maybe later, if the government successfully extends classification again. But eventually, the truth will come out. And when it does, America will have to confront what it did to the man who dreamed it could be better. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't die because a racist with a rifle hated him. He died because the FBI, the Memphis police, military intelligence, and organized crime figures conspired to kill him. He died because the people in power decided he was too dangerous to live. He died because he was winning, and they couldn't let him win. April 4th, 1968, 6:01 p.m., one shot. One of the greatest Americans who ever lived murdered on a motel balcony in Memphis. The killer wore a badge, and the truth has been classified for 56 years. But we know. The jury knew. The King family knows. Anyone who examines the evidence honestly knows. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by his own government, and they've been lying about it ever since.